And everybody, okay. So finally, wow, okay. Welcome to this second in our series on the prophets and prophetic literature. It's great to see you all. And it is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend and longtime colleague and friend of Clover's and all of that, Todd Linafelt. Todd Linafelt is a professor of biblical literature at Georgetown University. He has held distinguished visiting chairs at other universities as well. He was recently president of the Mid-Atlantic Region Society of Biblical Literature. He has 4 books. Surviving Lamentations was his first book, then a commentary on the book of Ruth. And this is cool. He co-authored with Walter Brueggemann an introduction to the Old Testament. And most recently, his most recent book is The Hebrew Bible as Literature. And I would say if you're interested in the kinds of things we're talking about today, that you would really benefit a great deal from going to that book. That might be a good next place to go in your journey, in your exploration of this. So Clover and Todd and I have been friends for a really long time. The late 80s, I think 1988, when we started seminary. Early on, he and I often got confused, got mixed up with each other. So when I got my scholarship letter to Columbia Theological Seminary, in the second paragraph it said, "Again, Todd, we want to congratulate you on your scholarship." Later, when we were both doctoral students at Emory University, and we would give these seminar papers at the end of each year that were kind of like a conference practice paper, and mine went a little too long, and one professor, red in the face for most of my talk when I got done, sort of slammed his fist on the table and said, "Todd, don't ever go over like that again." And this was 2 years into the program. He called me Todd, and we admitted 2 to 3 people a year. So, at any rate, he has a special power of nicknaming, which means that many of our mutual friends don't know that I sometimes go by the name Tim.
Wait, what?
No, some of our mutual friends don't know that my name is Tim. Right? Get it? Yeah, okay, right. Clover's he's known to go to the ends of the earth in search of great barbecue and double chocolate donuts. He is the founder and lead guitarist for the band Bullhog and the Rhythm Pigs, all lyrics coming from the Bible. With a jawbone of an ass, I have slain 1,000 men, things like that. Wildly popular with our class of 35 seminary students. We almost got paid once, and the rockumentary is forthcoming. He is proud father of Eleanor, who is a founding member, lead guitarist, and lead singer for an actual band, Queen Rat.
Oh, look at that.
It's a collector's item because Queen Rat had to change its name from Rat Queen because there was another band that had that name. His topic today is poetry and the prophets. Please join me in welcoming Todd Linafelt. Make sure you share your screen.
Thank you very much. That was a really nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen, see what happens here. It's funny, I actually have the invitation letter that Clover sent me for this lecture. And it's kind of a little different from Tim's introduction. She says, "Dear Todd," I'm not sure why the dear is in quotation marks. "I think we both know that inviting you to deliver a lecture on the Bible after my Tim is like inviting Keanu Reeves to deliver a lecture on acting after Dame Judi Dench. However, Tim still feels sorry for you, for obvious reasons, and he thinks it will do you some good to receive any invitation at all. I am therefore pleased," I just noticed that's in quotes, "to invite you to lecture on the topic of poetry and the prophetic books. It would, however, be preferable if you did not come in person, so we will arrange a Zoom lecture instead. I'm sure you understand. In the name of our Lord Jesus, John 11:35, I did not look that up, the Reverend Clover Beale. P.S. There will be no money. All right. So I'm very pleased to be here. And as Tim, apparently he's known, pointed out, we've known each other forever, Clover, Tim, and I, and that it seems like at least part of the inspiration for this series of lectures was Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. Here's actually a picture from 30 years ago, I believe, of Tim, Walter Brueggemann, and myself. I showed this to Clover earlier, and she said, "Wow, Todd, you've changed a lot," which I'm aware of. And she said, "But notice how Tim looks better than ever these days," which I have to agree with. But then she also said, on the other hand, Tim's really changed his fashion and has updated quite a bit, whereas you haven't changed yours at all. And the truth is, I'm wearing exactly the same shirt now that I'm wearing in that picture. The very shirt. So anyway, I think our time is about up. And, oh no, we still got to do a little Bible. All right, so a little Bible and poetry. So our topic is poetry and the prophets, right? The prophetic books' use of poetry in the Bible. I want to begin with a very quick kind of crash course on the nature and workings of biblical Hebrew poetry before we then look at some prophetic texts, think about how the prophets make use of the specific resources of biblical poetry. So I'm going to share my screen again. You all have handouts there, I think. And so you've got a lot of this material. We won't probably get through it all, but I think everything I'm going to share on my screen you have there and you can look at later as well as today. So basically with biblical literature, we've got two primary literary modes. Narrative, which always takes the form of prose, and then poetry. And poetry is very interesting. This is a much larger question for another time, but poetry in the Bible always takes the form of non-narrative genres. So to tell a story in the Bible, it's going to take the form of prose. Prose being a formal category, just meaning if you look at the page, it fills the page, right? There's no lines, there's no lineation, no white space around it. So biblical narrative, especially extended narrative, any stories of any length are going to take the form of prose, which seems, sort of, it might seem obvious and sort of uninteresting in a sense because we're completely used to encountering narratives in prose form, literary narratives, novels, always take the form of prose, right? No one writes long poetic narratives anymore. But in the ancient world, it was actually quite rare. Most of the narratives that we have from the ancient world take the form of poetry. So the Iliad and the Odyssey perhaps are the best known ancient long narratives, which of course are in poetic form. And Gilgamesh from the ancient Near East and other ancient long poems, again, always take the form of poetry, almost certainly tied to the oral performance of the poems at the time, whereas biblical authors, ancient Israelite authors, began to develop a prose style for narrative that in many ways prefigures, I would say, modern fictional narrative. But we're not primarily interested in that today, right? But I spent a little bit of time just describing biblical prose narrative, because in order to, I think, really get a sense of how biblical poetry works, it's necessary to see it in contrast to biblical narrative. So the stories from the Bible, one or two more words about narrative before we look at poetry, and then we'll be off into our topic. One of the maybe most important characteristics of biblical narrative to keep in mind is what I've called here at the top of this, the first category on this page of elements of biblical narrative, what I've called an economy of style. Now we might call it a drastic economy of style. In other words, a style that is economical in the sense of being sparse, laconic, not giving us a lot of detail. So we have a narrator who's very reticent to reveal things to us. One of the forms that takes is we have very little detail in terms of physical descriptions. So you notice, once someone points it out to you, maybe you noticed anyway, but you notice that you almost never know what anybody looks like in the Bible. There's very little physical description of either people or things. Occasionally, you'll get maybe one quality, one physical quality that the narrator will point out, and it's never gratuitous. It's always there for some reason related to the plot or related to the character. So for example, we find out uncharacteristically one detail about David's son Absalom, which is he has long, beautiful hair. And that's not an extraneous point, it turns out, but tied into his character. It seems to be an emblem of maybe his ambition, maybe even his arrogance, but it's also an emblem of his charisma. His beautiful hair draws everybody to him. It also ends up being his, emblematic of his sort of undoing when he leads a rebellion against David and is defeated, and as he's trying to escape, he's caught by his hair, his beautiful long hair, in a tree and just dangling. The narrative says dangling between heaven and earth. And then Joab, David's right-hand man, comes up and stabs him in the heart. So anyway, the only thing we know about Absalom physically is he's got this long, beautiful hair, and it's there in order to have these plot elements worked out. So very little physical description, which means it's a very non-visual style. And that also means that non-visuality and the sort of stripped down style means very little use of figurative language, of metaphors, similes, personification. It's just not much there at all in biblical narrative. And then finally, very little access to characters' inner lives. So physical description, visual imagery tends to be lacking in biblical narrative. It's very stripped down, economical style. And then also, this is really important in biblical narrative, but again, we would have to come back to that in another context. But very importantly, we're also given very little access to the inner lives of characters. We don't know what characters are thinking or feeling as these stories unfold. Now, all that's the background for moving into biblical poetry, because biblical poetry is entirely different. And part of what makes biblical poetry distinctive, and part of us becoming good readers of it, is to recognize that it works very differently than biblical poetry. Again, in the first place, it's not used for narrative, right? Poetry as a form, meaning lined out, the most basic sort of definitional building block of poetry is these lines that are in some relationship to each other, as opposed to prose. And poetry is not used for narrative in the Bible, but for non-narrative genres. So the Psalms, lament and praise, the love poetry of the Song of Songs, and the social critique of the prophets, then all tend to take the form of poetry. And these are non-narrative genres. So this second page in your handout, the page I've got on the screen now, is just a list of characteristic elements of biblical poetry. And I'm not going to go through these now. Some are more available in translation than others. But a lot of things do come over into translation. And the two things I want to focus on for today, as we move to look at some prophetic texts, the two elements of biblical narrative I want to focus on are lineation, the first of these. Again, the formal quality of verse as opposed to prose. And then also it's number 3 on this list, what the literary critic Terry Eagleton would call verbal inventiveness. That poetry is verbally inventive. It's more apt to use rare words, metaphors and figures of speech, heightened diction. Also tends to refer much more readily, much more pervasively to mythological context and to divine action. In other words, what biblical what ancient Hebrew authors developed, I think, or began to develop with their, I'm sharing my screen for a moment here. What ancient Hebrew authors began to develop with biblical prose narrative was essentially what we might think of as a very early form of realism, of literary realism, to present the world, to present people as they really are. In other words, in the real world, you don't have access to people's inner lives. You don't have a narrator in your ear telling you what someone's thinking as they're talking to you. At the same time, we get very good at interpreting and positing those things. And so if biblical narrative begins to develop a form of realism, which, by the way, typically literary scholars would date to the modern novel, right? That the modern novel is thought to be the origin of realism, but I think biblical authors a couple thousand years earlier are actually developing that style. On the other hand, biblical poetry does not feel bound to that realism, right? Biblical poetry is much more, I think, imaginative, much more verbally inventive than and not bound to that developing sense of realism. So let's look at some poetry, and in the first place, let's talk a little bit about poetic lines, which is, again, the kind of building block. And I'll do this quickly because I know we've got to get to the prophets. But let's just look at a non-prophetic text just to begin to get a sense of how the biblical lines work and what a typical biblical poem might look like. And here's from the Song of Songs, again, which is love poetry. And you've got here the Hebrew on the right side of the page, and then a very literal translation on the left side of the page. And so one of the things, of course, we lose in any translation of poetry is the sound of the words. That's always a big part of poetry. And there's just no getting around the fact that in translation, you lose that. And for the most part, we won't worry about it. But here's what these lines sound like if you don't know Hebrew. The Hebrew of this sounds like, and it sounds pretty good. Simeni kachotam al lebeka, kachotam al zroeka. Ki azah kamavet ahava, kasha kishio kina. Rishafeha rishpe esh shall hevet yah. You can tell, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can tell a lot of sound play going on there, right? The alliteration of kasha kishio kina, which is hard as Sheol, hard as the grave, is jealousy, and the hardness of the grave of Sheol is undoubtedly represented in the hardness of that kasha kishio kina. But then it shifts orally, right, with regard to how it sounds. Rishafeha rishpe when it gets to the fire, it's all R's and SH's. So anyway, that's what it sounds like, but that doesn't come over into translation, right? But one of the things that does come over into translation in poetry pretty well is the line structure. And so I say on the handout there, one of the main the sort of primary element of primary structuring principle of biblical poetry, what makes it poetry as opposed to prose, is not rhyme, which we're used to in a lot of traditional English poetry. It's not meter, not a regular metrical pattern with stressed and unstressed syllables, which defines basically all classical and European and Anglo-American poetry for centuries until 19th century and 20th century, basically. But rather than those elements, what seems to define biblical poetry is what we tend to call parallelism, the way in which lines are matched up with each other, and matched up in ways that they seem parallel to each other, typically two lines together, a couplet, or sometimes three lines together, a triplet. So what that looks like is here in the Song of Songs, set me as a seal upon your heart is the first line, as a seal upon your arm. So you see the parallelism, right? You see very obviously the ways in which these two lines kind of mirror each other. They match each other. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love, love is as strong as death, or literal translation of preserving the syntax there is, for strong as death is love, hard as Sheol is jealousy or passion. Now, but probably jealousy. So the parallelism, strong as death is love, hard as Sheol is jealousy. And it begins to sound like poetry also, right? It begins to have that structure. And then this little passage culminates in, it sparks, talking about love, right? Its sparks are sparks of fire. And then the final line there, right, is just a single word, a long word, but it sort of brings you up short, right? So you have this parallelism, this rhythm, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. There's a couplet, for strong as death is love, hard as Sheol is jealousy. There's a couplet, its sparks are sparks of fire, a raging flame, shall have it Yah, in Hebrew. So that final couplet in this little passage then culminates with a short line, which we might translate as a raging flame. So we see the parallelism there, hopefully, right? You see the way in which the lines begin to be recognizable as lines in this structural relationship, as opposed to just a series of clauses linked together syntactically in prose, which is what you would find in poetry. One other thing I'll call attention to in this passage, and then we'll look at finally at some prophecy, prophetic text, is that we begin to see, we can see here this sense of verbal inventiveness. We see a heightened visual quality with sparks and the fire. We also then see quite a bit of figurative language, right, of metaphor and simile. Not least, it's all through the passage, right? But not least of which is this sort of great claim of the Song of Songs, which is love is as strong as death. And that's, of course, figurative language, right? That's, of course, metaphor. And the way that works is that we have to stop and think, well, what does it mean for love to be as strong as death? It's not immediately clear what that means. It hits us, right? We think, yeah, that sounds like that might be right. But because it's figurative language, we have to pause and think, well, in what way is death strong? And then we think of all the possible ways that death might be strong. It's permanent, it's inevitable, it's fierce, it's scary, it doesn't let you go, it gets everybody. And then we have to think how many of those come over to our, what claims are being made about the nature of love here? How is love strong in all these ways, perhaps? So that's, of course, how kind of figurative language works. And it's a big part of biblical poetry in a way that it's not of biblical narrative. So, about the prophets, you're thinking. Let's go ahead and look at this first passage from get this here. The first couple of lines from Amos that I put in your handout, I think. So you see the same structures of parallels, right? We're looking at this point just at the lines. How do the lines work? So the NRSV here translates Amos 7:9 as, the high places of Isaac shall be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. This is in the context of a prophetic oracle, a description of the coming destruction that God is bringing on account of essentially all of the economic injustice that's going on. The slightly more literal translation here, preserving the syntax, destroyed the high places of Isaac and the sanctuaries of Israel desolated, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. So if we want to do a little analysis of this very briefly, we see the parallelism, right? We see that, the reason what makes this poetry is precisely this The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. We have that parallelism. Every element of the first line is matched up in the second line. The parallelism in biblical poetry is often more flexible than that, as we'll see, but a real kind of strict version of it has every element matched up grammatically and then often syntactically in a different order, as you see in the more literal translation. But the parallelism is clear. The one thing we want to add to this notion of parallelism, I know this is kind of nitty-gritty poetry stuff, but this will help you to, I think, really get in and appreciate the details, the texture of how biblical poetry works. But the one thing we want to add to that notion of parallelism is that the second line, or occasional third line, we've got a third line here, which we'll come back to, that the second line in a couplet or the third line in a triplet will almost always somehow heighten or intensify or go beyond the first line. So a lot of even biblical scholars will look at biblical poetry and feel like it's pretty much just saying the same thing twice. The high places of Isaac will be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel will be laid waste. The idea is the same, which is, man, there's going to be a lot of destruction. But what makes it poetry is not the idea, but the language, right? It's the way that it's rendered and the visual quality that it evokes in readers or listeners. And so one of the things that we notice is that rather than saying the same thing twice in different words, that biblical poetry will typically add something to the language, the imagery, the claims from the first line that typically heighten or intensify or go beyond, push further than the line before that. Now, in this case, we also have a third line, which we'll bring into the mix here, and notice the way that it's on the one hand still very parallel in meaning to the other lines. It's an articulation of the coming catastrophe, but notice the shift in other ways to that third line. The high places of Israel shall be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. So you got Isaac, Israel, house of Jeroboam, high places, sanctuaries, house. Those are all in parallel to each other, made desolate. And then where it gets a little, everything changes a little bit at least, but the real shift, I feel like, to that third line, you probably already noticed it, is the first person, right? The introduction of God as the agent of destruction. So we notice in the first two lines, which are more parallel to each other, that the vision of destruction is rendered in the passive voice, right? The high places shall be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And then it shifts into the first person. It's a much stronger claim. It's a much scarier claim. It's a much more problematic theological claim for God to say, and I will be the one rising against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. So the shift into the active voice, the calling attention to the agency of God. Also, we might see a focusing movement, excuse me, emotionally, anything, again, there's often a sort of an emotionally heightened aspect to the second or third line, intensified, and often that sense of emotional heightened, being emotionally heightened or intensified is often tied to more concrete imagery or more focused imagery. So if you talk about, let's say if you get a report in the news that said 3,000 people died in an earthquake, you think, wow, that's really bad. And then you say, and here's the names of 3 of them, and here's what their lives were like, and here's a picture of one. The concreteness is what makes you cry, right? It's the concreteness that affects you emotionally in a way that just the idea doesn't. Here we have a maybe minor version of that, but a more typical focusing to the house of Jeroboam. What I was really concerned about is this king who's exercising power in an exploitative way. So anyway, there's a couple of prophetic lines which we can see. I mean, it's a typical prophetic critique in many ways, but it's also very much making use of these obvious poetic structures. which you can compare with how the poetry of the Song of Songs work, right? It's the same sort of, same elements, the same workings, but very different content. Instead of love, this is a prophetic critique. Boy, lots of text lined up, which we're going to, of course, not really get to. Let's look quickly at one or two maybe other examples of prophetic criticism, which is mostly what the prophets do. Prophetic criticism, let me get another text up here. It takes the form of poetry, and then maybe finish out. We want some time for question and answer. I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah. So let me know, like I've got about 12:18 right now. Anytime you want to say it's time for question and answer, let me know. Otherwise, I'll move to it in a couple of minutes. But here's a couple examples, just because we want to see more of how what the poets do with this poetic form. Isaiah 24. This is a translation by Robert Galter, who's written a couple of very influential books on the literary nature of the Bible, including poetry. So here's, just notice here, see the parallelism. Terror and trench and trap upon you who dwell on earth. So we have these three terms introduced: terror, trench, and trap. This is language from siege warfare. Who flees the sound of terror. So we got the sort of table of contents in terror, trench, and trap. Nice alliteration there. In Hebrew, it's pachad, vapach, vapachat, vapach. So there's a real wordplay in Hebrew that Alter is capturing here with terror, trench, and trap. And then we see these three terms being focused in on. Anyone who flees the sound of terror will fall into the trench. So terror, trench, and trap. This is what you're going to get. You flee the sound of terror, which is the coming enemy, you'll fall into the trench. If you climb up out of the trench, you'll be caught in the trap. Or, and then notice this shift, right? So that's a couple of lines of sort of historical experience, right? This is what it's like to be in a city that is giving way to a siege. And as you're trying to escape, you think you're out, and then you're caught here, and then you think you're out, and you're caught here. But it's a heightened, but essentially sort of realistic portrayal of what it would be like to be in a city crumbling in the face of a siege. And then notice the shift. For the sluice gates on high will open, and the earth's foundations will quake. All of a sudden, we're out of that semi-realistic realm of a city under siege into a much more cosmic catastrophe. The tenor is elevated here. The sluice gates on high will open. These are the windows of heaven. Think of the book of Genesis when the flood comes. These are exactly the same sluice gates, the same windows of the sky that God opens up in order to allow the earth to be destroyed by flood. The sluice gates on high will open, and the earth's foundations will quake. Break, the earth will break. Crumble, the earth will crumble. Totter, the earth will totter. So we've gone from the sort of realistic expectation of warfare to this cosmic catastrophe. This is what the prophets do, is to just intensify and intensify, and this becomes a sort of a proto-apocalypse, right? An early form of the world coming to an end in this poetic form. Lots of repetition, right? That parallelism of break, the earth will break, crumble, the earth will crumble, totter, the earth will totter. And then a shift to, let's introduce a simile. Sway, the earth will sway like a drunkard. It will shake like a hut. And then this little section kind of ends with, its crime will weigh it down, it will fall and rise no more. So a poetic vision of destruction, a prophetic vision of destruction, rendered, of course, as poetry. And I'll just read this, and just to get a little more sense of how this parallelism works, but also how we can see the metaphorical imagery, figurative language, developing across the space of a couple of lines. And a metaphor is introduced and then developed, and we see, as with the previous poem, a sort of back and forth play between historical referent, what the prophets are actually being critical about and expecting to happen, and metaphorical imagination. So Moab, a traditional enemy of Israel in the Bible, who knows if this was the case in real life, but in the Bible, always representing sort of a violent neighbor who's going to get what they deserve. So the prophet Jeremiah says, Moab has been placid from youth, settled in his lees. And all of a sudden you realize in that second line, oh, Moab's being compared to a bottle of wine or a jar of wine. But Moab has been placid from youth, hasn't been disturbed, settled in his lees, never emptied from vessel to vessel. It's just been sitting there aging, in exile never gone. So we notice the structure here of Moab has been placid from youth, in exile never gone. That's the realistic reference, right? It's never been taken into exile. It's never been conquered by an empire. And in between, we have the settled in his lees and the never emptied from vessel and vessel. So the metaphor of, let's think of Moab like a jar of wine, is being integrated into this expectation of exile. But the metaphor kind of takes over. Moab has been placid from youth. Parallel line, never settled in his lees, never emptied from vessel to vessel, in exile never gone. Back to the metaphor of wine, so his taste has kept, his fragrance has not changed. So Moab is just as fresh and fragrant as ever because it's never been emptied from vessel to vessel. Metaphor for never having been conquered and gone into exile. And then the therefore switches into prose here. Therefore, behold the coming days, says the Lord, when I shall send him to decanters, to decant him and empty his vessels. It's the vision of destruction, but the metaphor of the wine is still there. And notice the shift to the plural here. I shall send him, meaning Moab personified, to decanters, to decant him, and to empty his, Moab, vessels. And then the final line just shifts almost imperceptibly into their pitchers will be shattered. And I think there here is the people of Moab, right? It focuses in. And I think, the image here that I immediately think of, Tim actually did more archaeological work in Israel than I have. But what they find in destroyed cities is just piles and piles and piles of broken pitchers, broken pottery shards, right? That's what characterizes a destroyed city. And so their pitchers will be shattered. At this point, it's not Moab being imagined as a jar of wine, but it's the result of the destruction, which is just a shattered city. And when you look, it's rubble, right? Their pitchers, meaning the residents, will be shattered. All right, so let me jump. Should I stop now or one more thing? Who's in charge here?
Go ahead and do another one, Todd, briefly, and then we can do one or two questions and maybe run over just a little bit.
Let me end with two texts, one from the Bible, just because prophets are mostly visions of destruction, right? Prophets are mostly critical in order to shock, and they're almost always critical of the leadership of people in power, political and religious, in order to sort of shock people into recognizing what's going on. But Second Isaiah, the middle section of Isaiah, which Tim referred to a little bit last time, is this unusually positive, right? Prophets are almost always critical, negative, things are going bad, get ready for it. But Second Isaiah, who's trying to comfort a community that's already in exile, makes use of the resources of biblical poetry in order to offer a much more positive vision of restoration. So here's the very last couple of verses of this section of Isaiah 40 to 55. For you, meaning Israel, who are in exile in Babylon, you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. You will go out in joy, be led back in peace. We see the parallelism. We see also the movement forward, out from Babylon in joy and back to Israel in peace. And let's have some figurative language. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song. I'm almost positive, although I've never tried to figure it out or look up see if there's any evidence for it, but I'm almost positive this is where we get the hills are alive with the sound of music, right? The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. We notice the parallelism, the mountains and the hills, these elements of nature that of course can't actually sing, shall burst into song. This is what makes it metaphors. But the parallelism, all the trees of the field, this other thing of nature, this other element of nature, which doesn't have any hands to clap, but it will clap its hands. So burst into song, the clapping of hands, the mountains and the hills, the trees of the field are all, in other words, celebrating, cheering as Israel moves from exile back into their land. And then instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, holding on to the nature imagery. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. So we got the parallelism of the two thorny, hard, brown plants, and the evergreen, the more lush evergreen, the cypress and the myrtle. And it shall be to the Lord for a memorial, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. And then you have there on your in the handout, and I won't read it now because I don't think we probably have time to do it, but you can have a look at it. To be honest, I can hardly read it without crying. Very moving poem by Judson Mitchum, which I won't read, but take some time at some point and read this. It's a wonderful poem, very moving, in some ways very plain spoken. This is a poet who's from the South. You can tell if you look at the content. Who's actually in some ways a very accessible, plain spoken poet, but he's got some interesting stuff going on. And notice the very end of this poem I'll just jump to, which is picking up on that passage from Isaiah 55. So that the poem culminates in where it's written in Isaiah that the briar won't rise, but the myrtle tree, there's a promise unfulfilled. She, the speaker's mother who's in a nursing home, will not go out with joy. Remember that passage from Isaiah, you shall go out with joy and come back in peace. There's a promise unfulfilled. She will not go out with joy. Still, if you had known her, you yourselves, like Isaiah's hills, would sing. You'd understand why it says that. And then here's the quote. He ends the poem with a quote from Isaiah, all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. So very interesting, I think, poetic use of. Let me get out of that then. It's interesting, I think, just to, maybe I'll end my part with just noticing that here's a contemporary poet who has clearly absorbed the poetry of the book of Isaiah and uses it to kind of frame this mournful poem about the fate of the speaker's mother, at the same time drawing hope from Isaiah while not quite able to buy it, not quite able to totally endorse. She will not go out with joy, but still we could understand what it would be like if she did. And then we'd know what it was like in Isaiah for the trees of the field to clap their hands. All right. I think I will stop here, and maybe we'll just have that at the end there.
Well, Todd, thank you so much first. We'll save a little time for questions, but I know, or we won't save, we'll take a little time for questions, but some people might have to leave, so I just want to thank you before we break up a little bit into Q&A. You've really, I think, empowered us to look at these texts differently. I think when you go back and look at prophetic poetry, but also poetry in other parts of the Bible, that you'll see things that you didn't see before, and it's going to open it up in some special ways. So really grateful for that, Todd. Thank you very much, and give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
Really fantastic. And those of you who stay, so Todd, you won't see me because I've got to use my mic on the laptop here, but people will ask questions and then I will pass them to you because he can only hear through this laptop mic, not through the...
Sure.
Anyone with questions? With a question? Just one or two, maybe. Clover's calling out the English majors.
I could reread that letter from Clover if we want.
Yeah.
I have some questions about that.
Clover never showed me that letter, Todd.
Yeah.
Why did the prophets structure the writings of Scripture the way they did in terms of poetic manner? Why?
Yeah. So the question is, why do the prophets structure their poetry in these particular ways? I guess part of that question is, where does it come from, these forms? But also, why not other ways? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And when you get the answer, you're going to write a book about it, and I'm going to want to know what the answer is. No, that's I think a really interesting question. And I've talked with people who I'm not really an expert on prophetic literature per se, but I've talked to people that are, and I mean, it's interesting. To a certain extent, biblical scholars haven't really thought about that, because everyone kind of knows that the prophets are set in poetry, but they don't care so much, haven't typically cared so much about it, because they've always been interested in, well, what are the prophets saying? It's about the content rather than the form, and then you lose all the poetry, right, when you just paraphrase it. So it's really recently, in the sense of the last decade or two, I think, that people have actually started to ask precisely this sort of question, which is, all right, we can see it's in poetry, we can analyze how it works as poetry, but why? Why is it that over and over again the prophets represent as poetry? I think kind of provisionally we've got some things we might say, which is, it's worth noting that they only shift into poetry when they're representing the voice of God, or typically do, right? So if they're just talking to somebody about something else, it's typically rendered in prose form, but it shifts into this more formal, heightened, almost incantatory, right? Poetry has this almost incantatory terror, trench, and trap, double, toil and trouble aspect to it that I think is partly just, if you could hear God speak, it would sound special, right? If you could hear God speak, it would have this formal, incantatory, absorbing quality to it. So prophets speak for God. They sort of often presented as losing themselves, and God almost speaking through them. So I think that's part of it. I think also that's not the only thing, because God elsewhere in the Bible speaks in prose, right? So it's not that everyone always represents the voice of God in poetry, but prophets tend to. But I think the other thing that prophets get with poetry that you can't get with prose, not that you technically can't do it, but that biblical authors have this sort of literary division of labor, right? That we tell stories in prose and we have this stripped down realistic style, but when we want to get a little crazy, when we want to really mix things up, heighten it, make it exciting, make it affecting, then we use poetry. And I think prophets want to do that, right? The prophets as orators want to be able to use metaphors, right? And so in order to do that with ancient Hebrew, just by convention, right? It's not that you can't make a simile in prose, you can, but by convention, we do that in poetry. So in order to compare the destruction of the city with the destruction of the cosmos, we need poetry in order to do that. And then finally, I think it allows them to have more of an expression of passion. Again, biblical prose narrative with its stripped down style, very little expressions of emotion or passion. And if you want that in any kind of really intense way, you shift into poetry. And so the prophets want to be able to have that expression of passion, of anger mostly, but sometimes of hope. And they also, I think, want to be able to use figurative language in creative ways. And that, I think, helps to indicate why they make such great use of poetry.
Thank you. Another question from Clover.
Well, I would just like to add to that, because I think what you're saying is, and what we know is...
I can't quite hear you.
I'll repeat it.
Just a minute. I'm just going to talk. The poetry
Just a sec, Todd.
works on us. And if the prophet is wanting the people to change, be impacted, poetry has that way of getting deeper, emotional, movement, right? It works on us, the listener, in a way that prose can't. Sorry.
Yeah, so Clover something of a comment. It was adding to what you were saying, that poetry, it's the sort of affective force of poetry versus narrative, that it works on us, that it has, even with the parallelism maybe, it goes deeper in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, we just come back to one of the things that Tim talked about last week. I don't know if everybody was there, but he did the lecture last week. And I think just come back to that notion of prophets as public orators, right? That their job is to persuade, right? And a lot of it's about persuasion. As Clover said, the effect, the affective nature of the poetry, which might affect hearers or readers more than certainly more than that stripped down style of biblical narrative.
Yeah.
That's of course a whole other topic, but that stripped down style of biblical narrative does other things really well, right? And so it's easier in some ways to see the literary qualities of the prophets because of the poetry, right? The poetry seems much more obviously literary, right? Fancy use of languages, fancy words, parallelism, structures, and all that. So when you go back then to biblical narrative, and you go back to this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and he said this, and she said this, and the story's over, it feels kind of impoverished, and it doesn't have that effective quality. But I just want to say, it does other things really well, right? It does other things, but it's much more based on ambiguity and things that are left in the background that are important. So yeah, the prophets, I think Clover's exactly right. We might say the prophets are using poetry precisely to have that rhetorical effect, in contrast to biblical prose narrative, which works in a different way, not the immediate gripping way, but the more subtle, drawing you in to the ambiguities of character motivation and things like that.
Yeah. Wonderful. We're going to have to wrap up now. Todd, thank you for staying longer. Sorry that we got started late, and thank you all for staying. Todd, we'll have to have you come back and talk to us about narrative, the art of biblical narrative sometime. It'd be great. But this has been really fantastic, and as I said, really empowering, I think, for all of us to go back to these texts and dig into them more deeply. So thank you so much, Todd. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Nice shirt on Tim.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Davis Hankins is going to be with us for our next in the Prophets series. Take care.